question was going to be, the next question that I had for you was, why do people get into this situation in the first place? And if they're not empowered in their confidence, I'd imagine that they get themselves into these situations. But I could imagine that somebody that is even pretty confident would feel very disempowered by this toxicity or the damage through this kind of relationship.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought this up, because anybody can end up in these kinds of relationships. And that's something that I think, there's a misconception that, people who experienced abuse in childhood, they're just going back to what is familiar. And while there is truth in that, someone who's experienced abuse in their childhood tragically doesn't necessarily have a healthy blueprint and is more likely to go into an abusive dynamic later. But there are a lot of people who are strong and confident and self-aware and self-assured and have come from, healthy backgrounds where, they were respected and valued, and they unknowingly walk into one of these relationships because they don't, an abusive relationship doesn't start out in an abusive way. This is something that happens gradually over time. And the more committed you are in the relationship, the more likely the abuse is to start to escalate. So once the abuser feels that you are committed and you're not going anywhere, there will be more of an escalation in the abusive tactics.
Yeah, I'm glad that you validated that, because I think that's a really important point to recognize, that it's not only people that, have had suffered through their childhood, and so that anybody can enter a relationship like this. And it's probably important to recognize, as early on as possible. So I want to circle back to the empathy component. Do you feel like abusers prey on more empathetic people that are more, I don't know, inclined to turn towards empathy?
Absolutely. We're an easier target, right? So, because we're more likely to fall for the sob story or the hurt bird, right? I mean, we're more likely to have compassion for this person. And even when they lash out or they hurt us, we're more likely to forgive, to try to understand where they're coming from or what led them to lash out in that way. You can think about it like, an animal in the wild, a little mouse is a lot easier prey, right? Versus, somebody that is, or an animal that's going to fight back, right? It's not going to be just an easy target. So, if someone is more outspoken, it has very firm boundaries, is not going to put up with mistreatment, is going to call it off and keep that boundary firm, they're a lot less vulnerable to ending up in one of these dynamics, or if they do, getting out of it early on.
Now, have you ever seen, Avery, any situations where there was a hope for healing through this relationship, like where they were able to work through this and come out healthy?
Yes. Oh, this is $1 million question, right? So can someone like this change? So I would say there's a spectrum, and it really depends. I mean, the answer depends on where the person falls on that spectrum. So the greater the abuser's lack of empathy and lack of responsibility, I would say in my experience, the greater those two things are, the less hope there is for change. Because in order for change to occur in the relationship, the person's got to be willing to take responsibility for the behavior that is hurting their partner, right? If you don't have that, then there's nowhere to go. So that has to exist. And then there's also got to be a certain amount of empathy for their partner, that this behavior that I'm exhibiting is hurting you and I don't want to hurt you. I love you and I don't want to continue doing what you're telling me is hurting you. So those two things really are a must. And so depending on where the person falls on that spectrum, in my opinion and in my experience, that largely determines how much hope there is for the relationship to move forward.
Yeah, and I just like to shine a light on those that are willing to do the work. I am actually going to be interviewing a men's coach next, and I was actually a guest on his podcast just recently, and we're talking about this evolution of like men's work. Like women have been doing this work for a while, and now it's like, men are starting to look at themselves. They're starting to want to get in touch with their wounding and, look inward. And I think that many of the times the culprit or the catalyst of this kind of, inner work that men invest in has to do with relationships that are suffering and hitting rock bottom. So
Yeah.
we can be hopeful that there are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that is the thing. A lot of times we do have to hit rock bottom in order for change to occur. That being said, a very sort of common characteristic in an abusive relationship is believing that the abuser is going to change, or that this is the last time that it's going to happen. And this isn't just unique to men being abusive and women being the victims of abuse. This absolutely can go the other way. I mean, this happens in all types of relationships. So, but I think that it's a dangerous assumption to sort of believe that the person is going to change just because they say they are going to change when they're afraid to lose you. This is part of the abusive cycle. And after there's been an abusive episode or outburst, there's typically this sort of remorseful period. And so you may receive a lot of promises about how things are going to be different in the future. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those changes are sustainable. And so certainly when we're talking about abusive relationships, this can be a very vulnerable, dangerous topic. And so I just want to make sure that, if someone is in an abusive relationship, that they're really assessing and evaluating their safety level and the safety of their children as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,